I don't think anyone would accuse me of having good luck when it comes to my checked luggage making it all the way to my destination on a trip. I've had a number of suitcases driven up days after my arrival. Most recently, our luggage on our move from Japan went to Washington, D.C. while we went to Austin, Texas. It all worked out, mostly because of incredible people that love us and intervened to take care of us, our sweet dog, and our baggage. I offer that background to explain that when I travel, I have two very big competing instincts. I am, in the depths of my soul, a human who wants to bring all of the things to all of the places. But I also very much prefer, given my luck, to travel exclusively with a carry-on. When Lieutenant Colonel Baba received orders overseas to continue his work as a pharmacist, he definitely erred on the side of taking more than he needed, and he tossed in some expired prescription medication. After arriving, though, he found his personal pharmaceutical stash was insufficient, and decided to just take what he thought he needed. This is Conduct and Becoming. I'm Erin, and I'm your host. In 2019, the Army activated reservist Lieutenant Colonel Robert Baba and deployed him to Camp Arifian to serve as the chief of pharmacy and officer in charge at the U.S. military hospital there. Baba, a pharmacist by training, headed pharmacological operations. Camp Arifian, funded and built by the government of Kuwait, also hosts forward deployed troops from the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, Romania, and Poland. While Baba was in Kuwait, the COVID-19 pandemic kicked off and cast things into uncertainty. In March 2020, the Department of Defense issued a global stop travel order, and service members overseas wondered when they would be allowed to return home. Also in March 2020, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration allowed emergency use of hydroxychloroquine to treat COVID-19 symptoms. The following month, they clarified that no one should be taking the drug for this off-label use outside of a supervised hospital or clinical trial setting. By June 2020, the science started coming back and revealed that the medicine was ineffective for preventing or treating COVID-19, and led to serious heart problems in some people. With that data in hand, the FDA ended their emergency use authorization and regulated a class of drugs back to their on-label uses as anti-malarials and anti-rheumatic drugs. The drugs both kill the organisms that cause malaria and suppress some immune activity. As the world settled into the new normal, Baba prepared to transition out of his role in what I think was probably summer or early fall 2020. Part of Baba's checkout process as head of the pharmacy was a handover inventory. There are a variety of military positions in which you become responsible for gear or other items that don't belong to you, that belong to the Department of Defense, but for which you are personally and financially responsible. Being head of the pharmacy in a similar vein requires enforcing the policies and procedures to maintain, track, and account for the drugs in the pharmacy. This is a pretty common sense requirement because, in addition to the everyday drugs like ibuprofen, and the prescribed but not controlled drugs like EpiPens, pharmacies maintain a supply of controlled narcotics with a variety of applications. You can't, for instance, have opiates going missing. But when the handover inventory was complete, it wasn't opiates that were missing. It was 2 bottles of hydroxychloroquine, the drug that the FDA rescinded the emergency use authorization for in June 2020. The outgoing non-commissioned officer in charge, the NCOIC, along with the incoming OIC, officer in charge, worked to investigate the discrepancy. They combed through the pharmacy's computer system and discovered a prescription for the missing drugs, which they traced back to Lieutenant Colonel Baba. But Baba, a pharmacist, could only dispense prescribed drugs. He couldn't prescribe them himself. The NCOIC and incoming OIC suspected Baba of dispensing drugs to himself without valid prescriptions and reported their findings and suspicions to the military police. When the military police came knocking and requested permission from Baba to search his personal quarters, he consented. Inside, they found diazepam, more commonly known as Valium, zolpidem, more commonly known as Ambien, and oxycodone. All three were controlled drugs which Baba had previously been prescribed, but that the prescriptions had expired for. They also found a series of non-controlled drugs that still required prescriptions, including metformin, albendazole, metoprolol tartrate, ketorolac, and piroxicam. I don't promise that I got any of those pronunciations right. Metformin is used to treat diabetes, albendazole is a dewormer, metoprolol tartrate is a blood pressure medication, and both ketorolac and piroxicam are anti-inflammatories. Investigators photographed a bottle with approximately 200 pills in it, labeled citalopram, though the contents were not submitted for laboratory analysis. The military police didn't find the 2 missing bottles of hydroxychloroquine or 2 other prescription drugs dispensed to Baba. As part of the investigation, Baba provided a written sworn statement, and in it he admitted to self-prescribing the blood pressure medication, the diabetes medication, and the citalopram, the antidepressant. He explained that he took the diabetes medication for a skin condition, that he took the blood pressure medication to get back on his blood pressure regimen, and that he self-prescribed the citalopram to battle a depressive episode sparked by the workload. In light of everything the investigation uncovered, the government charged Baba with negligent dereliction of duty, 3 specifications of wrongful possession of controlled substances for the Valium, the Ambien, and the Oxy, 9 specifications of larceny of military property, the property being the variety of pills, and 1 specification of making a false official statement. In line with the written statement Baba gave to investigators, he pled guilty to negligent dereliction of duty and admitted during his Providence inquiry to dispensing metoprolol and citalopram to himself without a valid prescription. He pled not guilty to the remaining specifications. I do think it's a little intellectually funky to plead to the negligent dereliction of duty and to make those admissions, but not to plead to at least some of the larceny specifications. Perhaps slicing and dicing them wasn't an option. Baba elected to have a judge-alone trial. The military judge acquitted him of making a false official statement and convicted him on wrongful possession of controlled substances and larceny of military property. With those convictions, Baba faced a maximum penalty of confinement for 27 years and 3 months, alongside a dismissal. The judge sentenced him only to a dismissal. You may have picked up in the last few cases that the sentence has included a dismissal, not a bad conduct discharge or a dishonorable discharge. When officers get fired as part of their punishment, they don't delineate it in the same way. It's more binary. Either they were dismissed or they weren't, and a dismissal carries much the same weight as a BCD or a dishonorable discharge. I do think, though, that most future civilian employers wouldn't know that they carry the same weight. I think hearing someone has been dismissed has a different impact than they were dishonorably discharged. The power in the word dishonorable just doesn't come across the same in a dismissal. A dismissal honestly sounds like a gentle firing or politely excusing someone from the remainder of their contract. On appeal, Baba asserted many of his convictions were factually and legally insufficient. The Army Court of Criminal Appeals agreed and vacated 5 specifications. They held that even though they set aside the conviction for 5 specifications, the judge would nevertheless have sentenced Baba to a dismissal, so they didn't believe he was entitled to further relief or resentencing. The ACCA got there by evaluating both the wrongful possession charges and the larceny charges. With respect to the wrongful possession, they observed that Baba did at one time have valid prescriptions for all 3 controlled substances. All of the prescriptions had expired by the time the drugs were discovered in his possession in Kuwait. Looking first at the Valium. Baba had received 9 separate prescriptions for the drug during his military career. His most recent prescription expired in 2016, approximately 3 years before the Army activated Baba and sent him to Kuwait. Similarly, Baba received 6 prior prescriptions for oxycodone, including 2 prescriptions written while he was in Kuwait. Finally, the Ambien. Baba had twice received a prescription for the drug, though both dated back to 2011, 8 years before Baba packed his bags for the desert. The Army specifically prohibits the use of a prescription drug without a current prescription for the purposes of inducing excitement, intoxication, or stupefaction of the central nervous system. The regulation clarifies that a soldier's use of their lawfully prescribed and dispensed medication for medical purposes after the prescription's expiration date does not itself constitute a violation of Article 112A of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. I would almost assume that given their intended effects, both Valium and Ambien contribute to stupefaction of the central nervous system, but I'm not a doctor, as my pronunciation probably made clear. It strikes me that the regulation the government focused on governed the use of a controlled substance with an expired prescription, which is a touch different than possession of a controlled substance with an expired prescription. Well after Baba's court-martial, the Army closed one of the loopholes in their own regulation. Before, technically, using a prescribed drug after the prescription's expiration, as long as it was for its intended medical use, not for excitement, intoxication, or stupefaction, was or could be fine for any amount of time after the prescription expired. The Army clarified in May 2021 that absent an otherwise specified date from the prescriber, use of the prescribed controlled substances, even for the intended medical use, would be considered illegitimate 6 months after the most recent date of fill. They didn't address whether continuing to possess the drugs after expiration was illegitimate. And sure, it's weird and objectively a bad idea to pack 8-year-old sleeping medication and 3-year-old anti-anxiety benzos, both controlled drugs, for a trip to Kuwait specifically. I don't know the details of Baba's travel, but if it was anything like the military contracted flight to Japan, customs on base was a lot less intense than customs off base. Kuwait, like most other countries, requires a copy of a prescription for prescription drugs brought into the country, and I presume that the prescription needs to be current. The penalties for bringing in drugs or even alcohol to Kuwait are severe. I think this is a good opportunity to let everyone know that there are give-back programs for controlled substances, so they're not left in your medicine cabinets for curious hands. In my experience, doctors and pharmacists don't give much patient counseling on what to do with unused prescription drugs. For instance, when I had my wisdom teeth yanked, I was adamant that I did not even want narcotic pain relievers to be prescribed. My spouse went to pick up my prescriptions while I was under, and, surprise, the doctor prescribed opiates, which the pharmacy filled. When I brought back the unopened bottle at my checkup, no one quite knew what to do with them, but I decided that was their business to figure out. I just didn't want them in my house. And to be clear, it's not that it's every prescription that just lies around later. Antibiotics, for instance, are often meant to be taken until they're gone. But drugs that are taken on an as-needed basis, like benzos, sleeping pills, and pain pills, don't often get used all the way up. Many pharmacies accept unused prescription medication so that it can be safely destroyed. I'm also aware of a few police stations that have prescription surrender boxes. Flushing the drugs is generally discouraged because they end up polluting the water supply. But back to Baba. The ACCA concluded that the government hadn't actually proved wrongful possession beyond a reasonable doubt. I think the way the rules and regulations are written kind of hamstringed the government. There was no direct rule on the possession of expired controlled substances, only on their use. But Baba wasn't charged with the wrongful use of expired prescriptions, just the wrongful possession. Because there was no direct rule, there was also no case law they could rely on. And no, it's not exactly a leap to assume that the person who packed up these old, expired drugs and flew them halfway around the planet intended to make use of the old, expired drugs where they now lived. But that's not what Baba was charged with, and those weren't the facts before the ACCA. The conviction for the 3 specifications of wrongful possession were out. Then the court turned to the larceny specifications. Baba had been convicted of 9 larceny specifications related to 8 separate drugs. According to the pharmacy computer system, all 9 prescriptions originated with 3 medical officers. All 3 testified that they did not prescribe Baba 7 of the 8 drugs. One major testified that he gave an oral authorization for Baba to use his name as the prescribing officer for piroxicam, one of the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs that's kind of similar to aspirin or ibuprofen. Very confusingly, that major was not actually listed as the prescribing officer for either of the piroxicam prescriptions. The records indicated a colonel and a lieutenant colonel made the prescriptions. Baba offered in his defense that many of the 8 drugs covered by the larceny specification weren't actually listed as missing. They hadn't exactly been stolen. But the NCOIC and Baba himself disclosed that the pharmacy's computer systems don't or couldn't audit non-controlled substances. Their focus was on accountability for controlled medications. Nevertheless, the ACCA affirmed 7 of the 9 larceny convictions, for everything except the piroxicam because of the weird testimony about oral authorization from the one prescriber, even though his name was not actually linked to either of the prescriptions. I chose this case because when I first skimmed the facts and read about the missing hydroxychloroquine, and that Baba also had unprescribed dewormer, it took me back to those scary first months of the COVID pandemic. I had a lot of empathy for the questionable decisions Baba made before people understood how COVID was transmitted and which drugs might thwart infection or effectively battle the worst symptoms. My empathy largely evaporated after reading about the very old medicine he knowingly packed without a valid prescription. My very last drop of empathy disappeared when I read about the self-medication with antidepressants. Putting aside any related concerns about the side effects from the various drugs Baba was taking and how it might affect his ability to do his job, beginning an antidepressant without supervision is so unnecessarily dangerous. One of the known side effects with many antidepressants, including the one Baba self-prescribed, is suicidal ideation. Getting the chemical balance right might take time, so beginning an antidepressant is something that should be monitored by a healthcare provider. There should be absolutely no shame in getting support for mental health concerns or taking medicine that supports mental health. But it's my hope that people do it in a safe way. And Baba, of all people, should have known better. Even though the ACCA dismissed convictions for the 3 wrongful possession specifications and 2 larceny specifications, each of the remaining 7 larceny specifications bore the possible sentence of a dismissal. The ACCA was confident that, even without those extra convictions, the judge would have still sentenced Baba to a dismissal, so they affirmed his sentence. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it. I invite you to submit case suggestions and feedback to conductunbecomingpod@gmail.com or on conductunbecomingpod.com. Join me next time when we head back to North Carolina State Court to discuss desertion, disappearance, and murder. Until then, take care. Conduct and Becoming is a podcast where I get to talk about interesting crimes and cases that involve U.S. military service members. I research, write, and produce the podcast myself. The opinions expressed are my own, and perhaps it's obvious. Conduct and Becoming is not approved, authorized, or endorsed by the Department of Defense.